Boy, so much information tonight. This has really been a fantastic set of presentations, and I am, I hope everybody's got all of it down. There'll be a quiz later. I have a number of questions. I'm going to try to distribute them among the speakers. People are still collecting them, and then Joe is sorting them and identifying who they should go to. That's a big help for me here. So I want to just make one comment about when your comments should be sent in. On your comment form, it says it right there. Don't send it in yet. If you write out a comment, that's great, but don't send it in until the official comment period begins, because if you send it now, they will toss it away. You can send it as a letter to the editor. You can send it to your state legislators, but don't send it yet to the DEC. First question I'm going to ask Helen to talk about. This is about equal protection in the law. Can fracking in New York be challenged in the courts because some citizens are protected, Syracuse, New York City, while other citizens are not?
So the whole issue of equal protection is one that is not particularly well understood. We like to think that what equal protection means is that everybody absolutely gets treated the same, but that's not what the law provides. The law provides that in instances of discrimination on suspect classes, race, creed, and some others, that there's strict scrutiny, and you have to have a really, really good reason for treating different people differently. On regular sort of non-strict scrutiny basis, all the government has to have is a rational reason, and it doesn't have to be a very good reason. It can be any reason really at all. And so what they've done, what the DEC has done with this filtration avoidance determination is they've hung their hat on the disparate treatment being based on this filtration avoidance determination. And there is enough, that is not necessarily a great reason. It's not a compelling reason. It doesn't really get to the problems with what the filtration avoidance determination, the reason for it versus these other, versus unprotected areas. And certainly anybody can sue anybody for anything, but there wouldn't be as many lawyers as if that wasn't the case. If we had to actually have a good reason to sue someone, there'd only be a few of us. So certainly anybody can sue for any reason, but in looking at this, we don't think that there's a very good case for suing on that basis. The flip side of that, and the reason why we're so focused on local action, is that there is this incredible deference to legislative action, and for the reasons and rationales that local governments or state government does things. So that same deference that this somewhat bogus filtration avoidance determination gets, your local governments get that same deference. They don't have to have a perfect reason. They don't have to have the very best reason in the world. They can have what industry thinks is a horrible reason to pass a local prohibition, and you get that same deference. You just have to have some rational basis. It doesn't have to be even a reason that the local government, or in this case the state, considered. The courts can say, well, no one even thought about this, but here's a good reason why they could do this, even though no one's thought of it. So you get that same deference at the local level. So in looking at sort of these fights that, everybody wants to fight this permit or that permit, and that's what we got started in with a permit fight, Schlumberger facility. It turns out you can rarely turn over these government decisions. So the idea was to be friends with the local governments and get things done that worked for the people and not just for industry.
Next one's for Lou. Are there currently in New York State any municipal wastewater treatment plants capable of removing suspected chemicals such as benzene from flowback waters? I would add radioactive norms, normally occurring radioactive materials. Why doesn't New York State suggest forcing the gas companies to build their own processing treatment plants?
I don't know whether there's a plant. The DEC goes into great length in the document talking about the capabilities of plants, but then they come down to this thing that it maybe one plant could handle one well pad. So not a whole lot of capability there. As far as the individual chemicals, basically the process is dilution. That's what these plants do. They dilute it down to the point where the volume of the pollutant in what's going to be discharged into surface waters meets a certain specification, a certain standard. So that's all it is. They're not going to make it go away. They're just going to put a lot more water with it.
That's exciting. That's wonderful. We're all downstream from somebody. Tony, I'm going to ask two questions. What's the story on propane fracking? Because I know, because in the SGIS, there's this idea of coming up with better fluids. And could you talk about cement casings? How long would a casing need to stay intact to protect groundwater?
I have to remember both of those, and can you remind me? So here's my standard reaction to the question about propane fracking. There are technical and economic reasons why, although at first glance, and certainly from a geochemistry and geology point of view, it seems to be a really good idea. That is, that the worst thing you can ever put down an oil or gas well is water. That used to be the standard mantra, the kill a well, you put water down it. And here we are pumping 5.5 million gallons of water down a gas well to stimulate it. And that's not the ideal thing to do from a geochemical point of view or geological point of view. So the best thing to do is to put a hydrocarbon down, and propane is a hydrocarbon. But from that's part of the technical point of view. The other technical point of view is it takes one hell of a lot of propane to frack a well. And there does not appear to be on the horizon an ability to produce that much propane, for example, in New York State, to account for 2,000 wells a year, where millions of gallons of propane are needed per well. Also from a technical point of view, obviously propane, although it does not have the potentially deleterious effects of getting into our water supplies by one means or another, as frac fluid normally does, it is explosive and flammable. And so the one company that is currently promoting propane fracking has been in the area numerous times. Perhaps some of you have heard the talks given by their chief technology officer. I've heard two of them. The first time he came to Ithaca, they had one relatively serious accident that ruined some equipment but didn't ruin any body. The second time he came back, he had to admit that there had been a serious accident, an explosion that put 11 people in the hospital, one very, very seriously burned, even though during the process of fracking with propane, it all has to be done robotically. People aren't allowed on the site. So those of you who are living adjacent to a propane frac site might want to move. So that's the technical part. It looks good, but it has some technical difficulties. From the economic point of view, as the industry has been fond to say, since the late 1940s, over 1 million wells in the United States have been fracked by mostly 4 or 5 companies. They have sunk costs in terms of equipment, personnel training, legal protections. They are not going to go quietly and let some young upstart company replace their technology. So there's a situation where within the industry there's a catfight. It's not likely that the big companies, the Schlumbergers, the Halliburtons, the BJ Services, although they do give lip service to research in their labs for looking at better ways to frack, and that's good, they should be doing that, I don't think they're going to allow this to occur from an economic perspective. The second question had to do with cementing the casing. how long does the cement surrounding each layer of casing supposed to last? Forever. Okay. As long as the well is a potential conduit from below to the surface, even if the well is correctly plugged, okay, the cement job still has to last. The plug is inside the well, the cement is outside the well. So the plug stops stuff from coming up the well, but it doesn't do anything to prohibit stuff from coming up outside. That's the job of the cement. The cement can't last forever. It's subject to chemical and mechanical processes that degrade it over time. That's the truth. Okay? So the answer to the question is forever.
Roger. The primary aquifers are only protected from surface drilling for 2 years, after which DEC will review this rule. And I think there are a couple of other places where a rule or an idea is in there for a couple of years. What happens after that? What type of process will be involved? Will there be public input, or do we know?
We were sort of having a discussion about this before the meeting. So after 2 years, I believe if you want to drill within 500 feet of a primary aquifer, you have to do a site-specific EIS. And I'm not sure what that entails, actually. I will be quite honest with you, how it differs from, what would they do different from a normal well? I suppose they would throw more casing down. But I think, looking at the history of the DEC, and we've done this through FOIL, they have many different site-specific triggers under the GEIS, where if you're so many feet from, a drinking water supply, a municipal drinking water supply, they have to do a site-specific EIS. And the original GEIS has all these conditions for when a site-specific EIS has got to be done. And as far as we're concerned, in the past 20 years, they've never done one once. So either that is so onerous for the company to do that they don't do it, or they never actually do require it and these things go forward. But we haven't been able to detect a single site-specific EIS. So that's all I can say at this point.
Helen, I feel like a game show or something. All right. Yes. Who will compensate me for my devalued property if a drilling site is constructed near me? Will it be New York State or the landowner who leased? And let me turn that into something about the S guys. It seems to me if property values, I mean, the community impacts, economic impacts haven't been addressed, they'll be in the next round. But if you have a personal experience like that, is that something that's, that I've experienced, and I was trying to put my house on the market, the neighbor leased, and so I couldn't sell my house. Is that something that is helpful to put into a comment?
So on this issue of, answering the second question first, certainly any of these particular experiences that people have, and we don't know what the DEC is going to ultimately say about socioeconomic impacts, but one thing that they repeatedly sort of say throughout the document is, well, we really have to allow hydrofracking to occur because of all these great economic benefits. Of course, they cite Penn State and Timothy Considine as their sources for this great boon that we all seem to just be refusing these lottery tickets. But so undercutting that argument of this terrific economic boom is very important. So instances of people being unable to sell their homes, having difficulty selling land that even if it's not leased but is near leased property, or property that is leased having difficulty to sell. I mean, those are very important points to make to the DEC. On the issue of who has to compensate who, that gets back again to sort of one of these things where, in looking at that, sort of flipped that around as well. So everyone in society sort of lives with their own property rights and together with the property rights of their neighbors, and no one has any property rights if there aren't some limitations, because if I can do anything I want with my property, that would include doing very negative things to your property, which would mean that then your property didn't have any value, and then we wouldn't really have a private property system. So private property law, or property law in general, is sort of this balancing act between what you can do and what you can't do. And so to the extent that hydrofracking is a permitted activity, and that's when they issue these permits, I mean, that's where the name comes from. The government is permitting, allowing it, presumably through this process making a determination that this is a good, acceptable, and beneficial thing for society. As another member of society, you sort of take your property subject to that sort of system. So there isn't simply through the issuance of a permit or some devaluation of your property, that's sort of the cost of living in society. And again, anybody can sue anybody for anything, but that's not going to be a real winner of a case. But where that analysis turns around and becomes important is in the context, well, two different contexts. One, an issue where that would be a successful suit is in a compulsory integration hearing where you were forcibly integrated and something beyond sort of a devalued property happened, but you have the physical intrusion of the government into your expectation and the hallmark of private property, the right to exclude others. You've had this physical invasion underneath your property, the leaving of all of these chemicals and water and stuff behind underneath in your property, presumably they say forever because it's not going anywhere. So you have this long-term permanent physical invasion of your property. So that's an area where you could, if there was some sort of, they have to compensate you separate and aside from the compulsory integration procedure as an eminent domain because there's a physical invasion. And there would be some, as part of that, you would look at the devaluation of your property. So in that context, there are some challenges. On the other side of things, that very answer as to why you don't get to sue your neighbor and win necessarily on a permitted activity is why landowners who have leased and would like to have gas wells do not have a successful taking argument against either their neighbors who support a ban or the town that implements a ban, because they live in a regulated society and there's a right to determine in a town some activities are suitable and some are not. And if your community is silent on whether or not gas drilling is suitable and the state government says that it is, you really don't have a case. But if your town says this is not a suitable activity, we do not want drilling in our town, the people that can't do the evil things to your property, they can't sue anyone for that. That's not a taking either. So again, it's one of these sort of good news, bad news. The law is a strange thing.
A question for Lou about seismic activity. Just looking at the executive summary of the document, which is 26 pages long. If you can't read the whole document, the executive summary is a good summary. They say that that no significant adverse impacts from induced seismicity are expected to result from HVHF operations. So the question here is, what about reports from Arkansas and other places in regard to fracking actually possibly causing many earthquakes, and the possibility of deep ground surface water and lakes from seismic activity? Thank you.
Okay, I think the jury is still out, but it looks like it's probably less likely the activity in the south to have been caused by the fracking as opposed to the injection wells. Most of what I've seen from fairly neutral sources would indicate that it's probably the injection wells that caused it, if it was not just a natural phenomenon, and probably not the fracking itself. And the last part was groundwater and seismic activity. Tony, do you have anything? So I don't have anything specific on it.
Tony, does the SGIS address the tens of thousands of wells that have been drilled already in New York? Could these old holes serve as conduits for methane and fracking chemicals? And also, I might ask, while the horizontal drilling has been on hold, vertical wells have continued to be permitted and drilled. So if you could talk about what we think might be happening with those vertical wells, you know, past and current.
There have been upwards of 40,000 gas wells drilled in New York since 1821, although the first one wasn't really drilled, it was excavated. DEC currently estimates that something like 30 to 35,000 oil and gas wells have been abandoned and have disappeared from their records. So there is always the possibility that hydrofracking in an area using high volume slick water, long laterals, which as you know involves many wells from a single pad and therefore stimulates a rather large volume of rock, that if that's done using compulsory integration wherein spacing units are closely spaced, north, south, east, west, that you got a well every 300 feet, east, west, or a well every 300 feet, north, south, that the probability of that stimulated rock mass having contained an old abandoned well goes up. The good news is that most of the abandoned wells are in the southwestern portion of the state, and most of the development that's going to occur in the Marcellus is going to be in the southern and eastern portion of the state, so that diminishes the probability but doesn't make it go away. So in summary, yes, it is possible that the kind of unconventional gas development we're talking about could unfortunately involve a existing gas well. Be prepared to read some news in the future wherein it is confirmed that that has in fact happened in places. It has happened for sure as recently as a year ago in Texas, for those of you who have been watching the news. So it's not impossible. It's another one of those things that needs to be considered. It is briefly mentioned in the SGEIS in one place as an issue, and the operator that's asking for a permit is supposed to do due diligence to determine whether, to the best of their ability, there are wells operating or not operating in a proposed spacing unit. I don't know how they're going to find wells that DEC hasn't found, but if they do find wells that DEC has not found, I would like to see something in SGEIS that requires reporting to the DEC of a well that they now found, that a company has found that the DEC didn't know existed. What was the second part? Was there a second part? No, that's it. Good. Okay. Thank you. Good question.
I'd like to ask Roger about the upcoming, well, do you think there will be a fall session of the legislature? And if so, what do we think might happen in response to this document? If no fall session, what do you think will happen starting in the January session?
Well, I think there will be a fall session. I'm not exactly sure when, but there are several union contracts that the legislature needs to approve. These are very big unions with state workers, so they will come back. Clearly, the mantra, and I think you mentioned it earlier, when we were trying to get several important pieces of legislation through the Senate that had passed the Assembly, and throughout the year we heard from each individual senator almost in lockstep that we're waiting to see what the DEC comes up with before we take any action. Well, they now know what the DEC has come up with, and I think it's pretty clear. I think that at this point they can't hedge on a final document. And when we look at what is live and what has already passed the Assembly, there are two important bills. One is the local control bill, Barbara Lifton's bill, and I think that that is something that they can take up, and I know the Assembly is very willing to scramble and adopt Jim Seward's alternate local control bill that I think is as serviceable in terms of clarifying that local governments have protection. I think that if there is an announcement of another session, I think we should give a push to see if we can perhaps get that done. Clearly, it's something the DEC has identified, and they can't really come up with that excuse, well, we don't know what the DEC is going to do. You know, we know what they're going to do. They're going to require that every driller certifies that their well is in compliance with local zoning, and they really could use this added legislative protection. The other piece, the other bill, is the hazardous waste loophole bill. This is the bill that would direct the DEC within 6 months to come up with a new rulemaking package for the handling of drilling wastes. The bill does not say that everything that comes out of a well is hazardous. It just says that they have to treat waste uniformly as they would any other waste. So if it has hazardous components, if it meets the definition of hazardous, it should be transported as hazardous waste. It should be disposed of as hazardous waste. That's something I think the DEC is not willing to push for. They seem to be quite comfortable with the solid waste status that they treat their waste with. But I think that that's something, at least to a lot of our quiet Senate Republican supporters on that bill, they say, well, we want to see what the DEC is going to have to say about that. We think they can do it through regs. And I think they're right. I think they can do it through regs. They've just refused to. And I think at this point, you know, I would say I'm not optimistic about getting it done this year, but, you know, it's worth giving a push. I cannot opine on what's really going to happen next session. I mean, there's a lot of different factors at play here, but I certainly think that we have a good shot of getting the local control bill to move next year. Yeah. So this is really interesting to me, and I think Lou touched on this. I mean, basically, it's kind of voluntary reporting. So basically, they're going to have a manifest. What we want from a hazardous waste designation is that there is a cradle to grave accounting, and that then the DEC gets that document. Since 2008, the DEC has permitted a little less than 1,000 oil and gas wells. I've asked the question, you know, horizontal wells. Since during the de facto moratorium, I don't know, maybe they've drilled 500, 600 of them. I don't have the exact number. I've asked the DEC repeatedly, where is all the wastewater from those wells gone? They cannot tell you. I've asked them, I've got a list of 5 wastewater treatment facilities I believe have been taking waste. Can you confirm? Are there any more? Do I have it about right? Their answer is, we have rules and regulations in this state that drillers have to follow, the waste treatment operators have to follow, and we assume they're being followed. So with this new proposed tracking mechanism, the drillers will write down where they got the waste, where they took the waste, and they will keep it in a file. That doesn't help me, because I can't foil that. The DEC can request the document, and I think that's the proposal. If they sense there's a problem, they may ask of the haulers, we want to see your manifest. But that does not aid in centralizing the information and actually getting a good picture of where all this stuff is going. So, yeah, we're a modern state, but our treatment and tracking is still very much in the 20th century. So, yeah, it should be required. Make that a comment.
And resend it after August 1st. For Tony, for Lou, first let me say about land use, I've said to many people, counties can't do land use. So, you know, the county can't issue a ban except for the land that we own. But we have control over roads, and we're working on a road preservation law right now. There was a news story about a DOT document and the costs of this drilling activity on state roads. Would you like to comment on that and about what the transportation impacts are likely to be?
There was a document leaked last week which indicates that it's a draft of the Department of Transportation's input on road impacts and transportation impacts to the guys. If that is in fact the document, it has a lot of good information in it. Number one, it uses the word ominous right up in the first paragraph. Number two, it points out that the DEC only considered trucking related to drilling the well. It didn't consider that, and you've heard the number 1,000, 1,200 trucks per well. That's for every well, not a well pad, all the wells. The Department of Transportation indicated that the additional trucking and road use will be significantly greater than what the DEC has put out, because the DEC did not consider all of the activity that would have to go into building pipelines or compression plants or treatment plants, or getting workers to and from the job site, or repair people to and from the job site. All of those things drastically increase it. And their estimates of the total costs were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't remember the exact numbers for the state and localities combined in order to get roads up to standards to start dealing with it. So huge costs. And it's a major impact, and none of that was considered so far in the economic side of this whole thing. Again, this was a bootleg copy. It looked pretty authentic. It made a lot of good points, and it made sense. So we'll see what actually comes out.
For Tony, recycling is one of those great green words. Could you talk about recycling in general, what's happening in Pennsylvania, and how they treat it in the SGIs? And any suggestions you have?
One of the points I made in my presentation is that starting about 18 months ago, Pennsylvania required operators in the Marcellus to report all wastes, solid and liquid, well, almost all waste, solid and liquid, not gas, solid and liquid coming off of a well pad. It took them 18 months to move that process along, where the data is coming from most of the operators, and most of the data appears to be bona fide, although there are still lots of holes in it. The problem there is that companies are reporting reuse and recycling in different ways than most people would understand it. So a year ago, the Marcellus Shale Coalition was saying that up to 100% of the waste was being recycled. And then the first 6 months of data came out, and it was like 18%. And then it moved up to about 34%, and more recently it's somewhere in the 40s. So that means that some companies are recycling or reusing a lot of their waste. Most companies aren't recycling or reusing any of it, but they're nowhere near 100%. What I would have hoped that DEC would have learned from the Pennsylvania experience is to make it a permit condition, or hopefully even better, a regulation that recycling is mandatory at the highest technical level currently possible. The reason I say that is obvious. The risk to us, the risk to our environment, to human health, animal health, plant life, is directly proportional to the volume of waste that's produced. You decrease that volume, you decrease risk. It's obvious that there's a political dance going on here. There's, as Commissioner Martens and our governor have said, I don't know how they said it yet because they haven't published the socio-political analysis, but they said that the SGEIS strikes a balance between wealth and health. That's their words, not mine. So I don't know how you do that without doing a proper scientific analysis of the health effects and the wealth effects. So the health effects are impacted by decreasing waste, by increasing recycling. The wealth effects are decreased by recycling because it takes money off the bottom line because it costs more to recycle. So by the way, when I think of a proper balance, I would have loved to have seen Martin's hands or Cuomo's hands when they did this. People think of balance as this: wealth, health. I think of health, wealth, where this is more important than this. So this issue of recycling is an extremely important one. I'm repeating myself here. Risk is directly proportional to the product of exposure and toxicity. We've already heard a number of people point out that fracking waste should be labeled as hazardous because it is, in many cases, toxic. You decrease exposure by decreasing volume. You decrease volume by recycling, make recycling mandatory.
A couple of the speakers talked about the fact sheet, what we learned from Pennsylvania. It's a page and a half. I mean, what I did on my summer vacation is longer than that. So, so I would like to propose the last question for every one of you to answer in whatever frame that you think of it. How does New York State's state of play compared to other states? Whether it's the SGEIS, whether it's the laws, whether it's the politics, whether it's what's proposed here, how do you see this compared to what's been done in other states? I've heard, Texas, for example, has many tougher restrictions of all places. So if you could take turns and just give us what you think is compared to other places around the country. Who wants us? Anyone? Tony, go ahead.
Getting tired of me. Many different ways you can look at that question. From the point of view, for example, of, put it this way, every state that I know of has made the following statement: we have the toughest regulations. So, and Pennsylvania, and New York doesn't have any regulations, strictly speaking. So I've always wondered how New York State can make. We have the toughest permitting conditions, perhaps, but we haven't seen the new permit application, so we don't really know. 14,000 Barnett wells, a few thousand Fayetteville wells, a few thousand Haynesville wells, a few thousand Bakken wells, 3,500 wells in Pennsylvania, a couple hundred in West Virginia, a couple hundred in Ohio, none yet in New York State. I don't know what to say about where we sit on that picture. It's still undetermined. As I said before, and it's repetitive here, the SGEIS is not a regulatory document. It doesn't have the weight of law. It can't require anybody to do anything. Even the permitting requirements don't have the weight of law. Company can say, check. Have you ever seen a permit application? Okay, check the box. If you check the box, it's presumed that you're doing the right thing. And as I guess Roger pointed out, when they get on the well sites, there's a negotiation that occurs. So let me summarize. I don't think we can safely say that New York has the toughest regulations because we don't have any. I do think that New York State has made great improvements in the current SGEIS for identifying risks, assessing those risks, and proposing mitigations that are appropriate for many of those risks, but I would like to have seen some prohibitions of some of the risks, and I would like to have seen less than a milk toasty pappy suggestion of perhaps maybe what New York might do. I mean, I think it's anybody who reads the SGEIS honestly across the spectrum would have to judge its tone as being very forgiving of industrial practice. It doesn't have teeth in its tone. So that's my final comment. Not enough teeth.
I agree with Tony's comment on the teeth. I think there's something fundamentally behind this regulatory system, New York versus other states, that should be out in the open, and that is that New York and Pennsylvania and the federal offshore areas are the only places in the country where the same government agency both permits and protects the environment. In the other states, there are at least two agencies, one that does the permitting and collecting of fees, and a different one that looks after the environment. There's tension, it doesn't always work perfectly, but you have a lot better chance of it working when you've got that kind of a system. So I think you need to go back to the fundamentals. At the very least, separate the permitting within the DEC from the agency that's out checking and protecting the environment.
So when I first spoke on the SGEIS for the first version in November of 2009, I guess, at that point in time I concluded I really wished that I'd had the DEC as a parent when I was a teenager, because you would never get in trouble. They'd encourage and they'd support, but you would never ever like get sent to your room. And I don't think too much has changed in that way. They've changed some of the language a bit. Now they talk about permit conditions and/or regulations in some places, but the document still remains very aspirational and not very particular about anything that's going to be done. I mean, if you were to start, instead of looking at the SGEIS and going through it page by page and sort of marking it up, and you were to think, what would I like the SGEIS to look like if I started from scratch? There isn't anything in there on sort of accumulating information and providing it to the public. There's no sort of, all of this sort of voluntary reporting, it stays with the company, it doesn't go to the DEC, it doesn't get filed electronically somewhere. They aren't doing any groundwater monitoring wells versus using people's well water as the test stations for this. Like, you know, how about putting some, if there aren't any wells close, you know, putting some wells out there for a very particular purpose of monitoring and posting those results and letting people see what happens. And so there's a lot missing from the SGEIS, which is why I said with some degree of seriousness that you don't even have to read it to comment on it. And so in that sense, there's still a lot of work to be done. But New York has really distinguished itself and the people of New York, I give the credit to, not our leadership so much. It seems like they'll only do what we're sort of drag them pushing and screaming to do, but that we don't have high volume horizontal fracking here now. So that is a victory, and to the extent that we can continue to keep this out, that we can set up some movement for a statewide ban by having local bans and across the state, as Karen's map showed earlier, and that fills in a bit. That's another groundswell of community opposition to this that cannot be easily denied. It's not a bunch of hippies in Ithaca that just don't want hydrofracking. So we have lots of friends, and there's lots of people here tonight from all over the state, and I think I think we deserve a lot of credit. I wouldn't give too much to the DEC.
Well, Helen took some words out of my mouth. It's a great lobbyist answer, at least, to acknowledge, at least the good that's happening in New York. I do spend some time talking with my counterparts in other states for the Sierra Club, and it's fascinating. I think you talk to the folks in Louisiana and Oklahoma, and they say, we feel really bad for your water in New York, but you have to understand where we are. The natural gas industry is almost like another environmental group. So I think that sometimes there's a different perspective. I think I would like to, instead of looking at necessarily what other states are doing, although I think with Pennsylvania essentially banning, although it's through request, but wastewater going to publicly owned treatment works. I have no idea why we can't do that in New York. I mean, that just seems ridiculous to me, and that always sticks out as why can't we do that, and why are we running the risk of actually accepting Pennsylvania's waste? But not looking at other states, but just looking at what other groups are doing. I was just really impressed to see what various grassroots groups have done here in Tompkins County, what Citizens Campaign for the Environment has done in terms of map leasing. And Karen, your work wherever Karen, is in terms of frac tracker and mapping. Fantastic. And, you know, the DEC time and time again says, we cannot predict the future, so we will not do substantive cumulative impact. You know, they'll look at cumulative impact of one aspect or another, but we have the technology to do this, and Karen has just demonstrated a bit of what we can do. But, you know, I think we have the capacity, and I think before this process is over, I think private citizens, private groups will probably end up doing the cumulative impact analysis for New York State just to show them up. But it can be done, and we're not asking them to predict the future. We're asking them to plan for it, and that's easily done. So that's what I'd like to say. Thanks.
Thank you all once again for coming. Thank you for caring about this. We have the room for about another half hour if you want to hang around and ask more questions or strategize and, you know, everything else that's possible when we're together. Thanks to the many, many volunteers who put this on, and stay tuned for version 2. Good night.